Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. What happens when suburban HOA rules collide with real farm life? They demanded I repaint my barn, hide my equipment, and pay fines, then sent a certified threat to take my land. I asked them to prove I was in their HOA. They proudly did. And that's when I realized their entrance sign might be sitting on my property. I'm a third-generation farmer on a 15-acre property that's been in my family since my grandfather bought it back in the 1960s. It's not fancy. It's not supposed to be. It's a working farm with chickens, a couple of goats, a vegetable operation that keeps me busy from March through October, and enough equipment to make a suburban dad's tool collection look like a toy box. We've got mud, we've got manure, we've got a pole barn that's older than I am but still does its job perfectly, and until about 2 years ago, we had privacy. That changed when a developer bought the 50 acres of woodland that bordered my property to the east. Beautiful old trees, some of them probably 100 years old, all got clear-cut in about 3 weeks. I watched it happen from my porch, feeling sick to my stomach as the dozers tore through what used to be a buffer between my farm and the rest of the world. Then came the construction crews, and within a year that empty wasteland transformed into something the developer called a luxury community. I called it suburban hell. Picture this, about 60 identical houses, every single one of them painted some variation of beige, tan, or what I can only describe as sad oatmeal. They all had the same black shutters, the same boring landscaping with those tiny ornamental trees that would never provide actual shade, and the same vinyl siding that probably cost more than my entire tractor. The streets were named things that sounded like a marketing team came up with them in 5 minutes. The whole place looked like someone hit copy and paste 50 times and called it a neighborhood. And of course it came with an HOA. I'd heard about HOAs before. Everyone has horror stories. But I'd never dealt with one personally because, well, I lived on a farm that existed decades before any of these houses were even a blueprint. My property line ran right along the back of about 8 of these new houses, separated by a wire fence I'd put up years ago to keep my goats from wandering. Right near that fence line, maybe 40 feet from the property boundary, sat my pole barn. This barn was my grandfather's pride and joy when he built it in 1979. It's a simple structure. Metal roof, wood-sided, weathered gray from decades of sun and rain. Inside, I kept my tractor implements, my rotary cutter, my box blade, pallets of feed bags, rough-cut lumber I'd bought from a local sawmill, spare parts, tools, and all the other necessities of running a farm. To me, it was beautiful in its functionality. To my new neighbors, apparently, it was an eyesore. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I'd just finished feeding the chickens and was heading back to the house for breakfast when I noticed something bright yellow attached to my front gate. As I got closer, I realized it was an envelope. A very official-looking envelope with a logo I didn't recognize. I opened it right there, standing in my driveway, still wearing my mud-covered boots. The letter inside was printed on heavy paper stock and started with Dear Resident, in a font that was trying way too hard to look important. It went on to inform me that the board had received multiple complaints about my property and that I was in violation of several community standards. Specifically, it claimed my shed was an unapproved outbuilding that didn't meet aesthetic requirements, and the items stored near it, my tractor implements and lumber, constituted visible clutter that diminished property values. The letter demanded that I remove all visible equipment, paint my barn in a color called desert sand to match the community palette, and complete these changes within 14 days. It was signed by the board president. I actually laughed out loud. I laughed because the sheer audacity of someone thinking they could tell me what to do with my own property that had existed long before their cookie-cutter houses, was so absurd it was almost funny. I wasn't part of their HOA. I'd never signed any agreement. I'd never attended any meetings. I didn't even live in their development. I was on a farm, a working, operating, functional farm. I figured it was a mistake, some kind of clerical error where they'd gotten their property records mixed up. I tossed the letter on my kitchen counter and forgot about it. I had actual work to do, like fixing a section of fence the goats had decided to test and prepping my fields for fall planting. A week went by without incident. Then, on the following Tuesday, I was out by my barn doing maintenance on my tractor. I had the hood up, I was elbow deep in grease trying to replace a hydraulic line, and I was wearing my worst work clothes, the ones with more holes than fabric. I'd probably been working for about 2 hours when I heard voices coming from the direction of the fence line. I looked up and saw 3 people walking across my property. Not along the fence, not on any kind of path, just straight across my land like they owned it. 2 women and a man, all dressed like they were heading to a business meeting. The woman in front was carrying a clipboard, which should have been my first warning sign. They completely ignored the no trespassing signs I had posted every 50 feet along that fence line. I stood up, wiping my hands on a rag, and watched them approach. The lead woman, who I'd later learn was the board president, had this expression on her face like she'd just stepped in something unpleasant. She was actually holding her hand over her nose. When they got within talking distance, she didn't bother with pleasantries. She asked me why I hadn't complied with the notice. She said the word notice like it was a legal document from the Supreme Court. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about. She gestured at my barn with her clipboard and said it was still unpainted and still surrounded by junk. She said junk with the same tone most people reserve for describing a sewage spill. That's when I realized she was talking about my equipment, my several $1,000 tractor implements, my carefully stacked lumber, my spare parts that were worth more than her car. I took a breath and explained as politely as I could manage that I wasn't part of her HOA. I told her this was my property, had been my family's property for 3 generations, and I'd appreciate it if she and her friends would leave. Her response was to smile in this condescending way and tell me that property values affected everyone in the area and that the board had authority to enforce community standards on all properties within the boundary. I asked her what boundary she was talking about. She said the community boundary, like that explained everything. I told her again, more firmly this time, that I wasn't in her community, wasn't in her HOA, and if she didn't leave my property in the next 30 seconds, I'd call the sheriff for trespassing. That's when her whole demeanor changed. The fake smile disappeared. She got this look on her face like I'd personally insulted her mother. She told me I was making a big mistake. She said once the fines started hitting my mortgage, I'd regret being so hostile to someone trying to help me maintain my property value. Then she turned around and marched back toward the fence line, her 2 board members following like obedient ducklings. I watched them go, shook my head, and went back to fixing my tractor. I figured that would be the end of it. I'd made it clear I wasn't interested in playing along with their games, and they'd realized they had no authority over me. I was wrong. 3 days later, I found an envelope in my mailbox, not attached to my gate this time, but actually delivered through the postal service. Inside was a bill, an actual invoice printed on official-looking paper, charging me $100 for non-compliance with community standards and an additional $50 administrative fee for requiring a follow-up inspection. I called the number printed at the bottom of the invoice. A woman answered and identified herself as the management company that handled the HOA's finances. I explained the situation, told her I wasn't part of the HOA, and asked why I was receiving bills. She put me on hold for almost 10 minutes. When she came back, she said the board president had assured her that my property was included in the development and that I was refusing to comply with valid regulations. I told her to check her property records. I gave her my parcel number, my deed information, everything. She said she'd look into it and get back to me. She never called back. Instead, the following week I got another envelope. This one claimed I owed $500 for continued non-compliance and an additional $200 for verbal abuse of a board member during an official inspection. Verbal abuse. I'd told them to get off my property. Apparently that counted as abuse in their world. I was starting to get angry now. This wasn't funny anymore. These people were actively trying to extort money from me for violations I hadn't committed on property they didn't control. But it got worse. The week after that, I was in town getting supplies at the feed store when I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a guy introduced himself as the owner of a junk removal company. He said he'd been hired to clear out some items from my property and wanted to confirm the address before sending his crew. I asked him who had hired him. He gave me the name of the HOA management company. I explained the situation to him, told him nobody had permission to remove anything from my property, and that if anyone showed up, I'd consider it theft and call the police. He was quiet for a moment, then said he appreciated the heads up. He told me he'd driven past my property earlier to scope out the job, and he'd recognized it as a working farm, not some suburban backyard. He said the whole thing seemed off to him anyway. He apologized for the confusion and said he'd be canceling the job and refunding the HOA's deposit. I thanked him. At least someone in this situation had some common sense. But the board president didn't give up. 2 days after that phone call, I received a certified letter. I had to sign for it at the post office, which meant taking time out of my day to drive into town. The letter inside was 3 pages long. It informed me that I now owed over $3,000 in accumulated fines and fees. It stated that if I didn't pay within 10 days, the HOA would place a lien on my property and begin foreclosure proceedings to recover the debt. Foreclosure. On a property they had no legal claim to. I sat in my truck in the post office parking lot, reading this letter over and over, trying to wrap my head around the level of delusion required to send something like this. These people genuinely believed they had the authority to take my farm because I wouldn't paint my barn beige. That's when I decided it was time to stop being nice. I went home and scanned every document I'd received. Then I drafted an email to the HOA board. I kept it polite. Almost painfully polite. I said I was confused by the fines and the threats. I explained that before I could consider paying anything, I needed them to provide documentation proving their authority over my property. I specifically asked for the legal plat map showing my parcel as part of their development, any deed restrictions on my land, and copies of any signed agreements I'd supposedly entered into. I sent the email and waited. The response came less than 24 hours later. The board president had replied directly, and her tone was smug. She said she was happy to provide the documentation that proved their jurisdiction. Attached to her email was a PDF of the developer's plat map for the entire community. I opened it and zoomed in on the section that bordered my property. And there it was, clear as day. My 15 acres were shown on the map, outlined in bold lines. But inside that outline, in large gray text, were the words, "Not a part." My property was explicitly labeled as not being part of their development. I sat back in my chair and smiled. They'd just handed me everything I needed. But as I studied the map more closely, something else caught my eye. The property boundary line between my land and the development didn't quite match where I thought it should be. I grabbed my own survey documents, the ones from when my grandfather had the property officially surveyed in the 1980s, and compared them to the plat map. The HOA's fancy entrance, the one with the big stone pillars and the expensive brick sign that said the name of their community in raised bronze letters, appeared to be built on my side of the property line. I couldn't be sure without professional confirmation, but if I was reading these documents correctly, they'd encroached on my land. The next morning, I called a surveyor. I explained the situation, sent him copies of my documents and the HOA's plat map, and asked if he could come out and do an official survey to confirm the property lines. He said he could be there in 3 days. Those were a long 3 days. I kept working, kept doing my normal farm routine, but my mind was constantly running through scenarios. If the HOA had built on my property, what did that mean legally? Could I make them move it? Could I charge them for the unauthorized use of my land? The surveyor showed up on a Thursday morning with his equipment and his assistant. They spent about 4 hours taking measurements, checking coordinates, and consulting their GPS devices. I watched them work, trying not to get my hopes up. When they finished, the surveyor called me over to where he'd placed a series of bright pink stakes in the ground. He pointed to the line of stakes, which ran right through the middle of the HOA's entrance sign. He said the actual property line was about 3 feet into what the HOA thought was their property. Their entrance, their brick pillars, and the first 50 feet of their vinyl privacy fence were all on my land. I asked him to put that in writing. He said he'd have an official report ready in 2 days. I thanked him, paid his fee, and went back to my house to make another phone call. This time I was calling a property lawyer. I'd never needed one before, but I'd asked around and gotten the name of someone who handled boundary disputes and HOA issues. The lawyer listened to my story, asked me to send him all the documentation, and said he'd call me back after reviewing everything. He called back that same afternoon. He told me I had an excellent case. Not only was the HOA harassing me without jurisdiction, but they'd also committed trespass by building on my property without permission. He said he could send them a letter that would make very clear exactly how much trouble they were in. I told him to do it. The letter went out via certified mail 3 days later. The lawyer sent me a copy, and I have to say it was a thing of beauty. It was professional, coldly polite, and absolutely devastating. It started with a cease and desist, ordering the board to stop all harassment, stop sending any further notices or fines, and stop making any claims about having authority over my property. Then it addressed the trespassing issue, specifically naming the board president for leading unauthorized entry onto my land. But the best part was the section about the encroachment. The letter explained in clear legal terms that the HOA had constructed improvements on my property without permission, and that under state law I had several options. I could demand they remove everything at their own expense, I could claim ownership of the improvements, or I could negotiate a settlement. The letter proposed a settlement. The HOA would pay to demolish and relocate their entrance sign and fence at their own cost, plus pay me $10,000 for the encroachment and another $5,000 for the harassment and attempted extortion. They had 30 days to respond. I didn't hear anything for about a week. Then my lawyer called and said he'd received a frantic voicemail from the HOA's management company. They wanted to meet. We set up a meeting at my lawyer's office. I showed up in my work clothes because I'd come straight from the farm, and I honestly didn't care about impressing these people. The HOA sent 3 board members, not including the president and their lawyer. Their lawyer did most of the talking. He'd clearly reviewed the situation and realized his clients had screwed up badly. He tried to negotiate, suggesting maybe we could work out an easement agreement where I'd grant them permission to keep the sign where it was in exchange for a smaller payment. My lawyer shut that down immediately. He pointed out that the HOA had already demonstrated they couldn't be trusted to respect property boundaries, and that any easement agreement would just invite future problems. The HOA's lawyer asked if I'd accept a lower settlement amount. I said no. The amount in the demand letter was more than fair considering what they'd put me through. One of the board members, an older guy who looked like he hadn't slept in days, asked if there was any way to resolve this without having to tear down the entrance sign. He said it had cost them $25,000 to build, and it was the signature feature of the community. I told him I didn't care what it cost them. They built it on my property without permission. That wasn't my problem. They asked for time to consider their options. My lawyer said the 30-day deadline stood. After that, we'd be filing a lawsuit. The meeting ended. I went home and got back to work. I had fall crops to harvest and a chicken coop that needed repairs. Life on a farm doesn't stop just because you're dealing with legal drama. 2 weeks later, my lawyer called with an update. The HOA had held an emergency meeting, and the neighborhood had voted to remove the board president. Apparently, when word got out about what she'd done, how much money she'd potentially cost the HOA, and the fact that she'd been harassing someone who wasn't even in their community, people were furious. But the real problem was the money. The HOA's insurance wouldn't cover the cost of fixing the encroachment because the board president had acted outside her authority. The developer who built the community refused to help, saying it wasn't his problem anymore. That meant the cost of demolishing and rebuilding the entrance, plus my settlement, would come entirely out of the HOA's reserve funds. Those reserve funds were supposed to be for road maintenance, snow removal, and community improvements. Instead, they were going to be depleted to fix one person's massive mistake. 3 days before the deadline, the HOA's lawyer called mine and said they'd accept the settlement terms. They'd pay the $15,000 and hire contractors to move the entrance sign and fence. My lawyer drew up the agreement. Both parties signed. I got my check. And then I got to watch the show. The demolition crew showed up on a Monday morning. I was sitting on my porch drinking iced tea, watching them work. They brought in a small excavator and started tearing out the brick pillars first. Each brick that fell felt like a little victory. The bronze sign came down next. They loaded it onto a truck, probably to reuse it wherever they rebuilt the entrance. Then came the fence posts, one by one, until that whole section of overpriced vinyl was gone. The crew worked for 3 days. When they were done, there was just a patch of torn-up ground where the HOA's pride and joy used to stand. Meanwhile, my barn sat exactly where it had always been, unpainted, weathered, perfectly functional, and completely legal. I heard through some of the more reasonable neighbors that the new HOA board was a lot less aggressive about enforcement. They'd learned a very expensive lesson about overstepping their authority. Property values in the development apparently took a small hit, not because of my farm, but because word got out about the mismanagement and the depletion of the reserve funds. As for me, I took that $15,000 settlement and used it to finally replace the roof on my barn. Not with metal that matched the surrounding houses, but with the same corrugated steel my grandfather would have used. I also bought a new tractor attachment I'd been eyeing for months. Life went back to normal. I still wake up early to feed the animals. I still get covered in mud and grease. I still stack my equipment wherever it's convenient. And every time I look at that fence line, I remember the time a suburban HOA tried to tell a farmer how to run his farm. They lost. I won. And my barn still stands, unpainted and proud, exactly as it should be. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Back about 7 years ago, I was promoted to office manager of a small construction company. I inherited a very messy role. The previous office manager was disorganized and technologically disadvantaged. When I came into the role, I was brand new to the type of work, but I have always been very detail-oriented. I didn't understand the vendor or inventory process, so I immediately began to log everything I could so I would be able to make reports/understand it all. Fast forward about 2 months into the role, and the owner of the company informs me he only wants to sign checks 1 day a week. Essentially, we would inform our vendors that any invoices received Friday to Thursday at noon would have a check cut and signed on Friday. I am not sure if this is standard anywhere else, but judging by a few vendors' reactions, it wasn't in this industry. Understandable, we are talking about truck drivers who go and pick up a load of material, pay for it, then deliver it to the job or our yard. So if they do that Friday, turn in the invoice, they are out $500 to $1,000 until the next Friday. They were used to being paid within 1 to 2 days, and some of these guys live paycheck to paycheck. It wasn't ideal for them. I sent out an email to the vendors and explained the processes. While not all of them were happy, no one had too much of an issue with it. I gave them, I think, like 2 weeks of notice before the policy would begin. Plus, we had worked with all of them for years. They knew we were good for the money. Then there was this one vendor. He stated it was going to be a headache. I apologized, explained this was the new policy and we couldn't adjust. He accepted it, I thought, and we moved on. 3 or 4 weeks later, he calls me in a hissy fit because he needs his check now. I apologized, explained to him that his check was going to be signed the next day. This was a Thursday, as per our policy, and told him my hands were tied. He hung up on me and called my coworker, project manager. He was screaming into the phone, which, since we were in the same tiny office, meant I heard every word. It ended with, "I won't work with that bitch from here on out. I will only talk with you." Oh, really? That is how it is? Well, here is the thing. Like I said, I am pretty detail-oriented. The product he delivered to our yard was consistently off. My system would say we have 100 yards of it, but my super would be asking for 3 more loads. 45 yards each, because the back had roughly 10 yards left. I had brought up the issue with the owner and super. We had established a new protocol that our personal crew truck drivers needed to fill out papers every day to show what they were taking to projects. I was keeping track of every yard, and sure, there should have been some loss, but 100 yards? I had always assumed it was a shortage on our end, that we were overusing this material, or they weren't tracking their loads to jobs correctly, or we were measuring it incorrectly in the back. Probably a combination of the 3, after being called a beach though. I called one of my vendors who delivered a different material and asked him if he could deliver this material. I told him how much we got, 45 yards a truck, usually 3 truckloads every other week, for blank cost, and he was bewildered. He goes, "How is that guy matching that cost? That is unbelievably low." Then he asked me who the vendor was. He tells me, "That guy's truck can't carry more than 20 yards. And when I was hesitant to believe this, he added, "Do you get weight receipts?" I had never heard of weight receipts. Again, I was an absolute baby in this industry. No one had trained me. However, I had noticed that every other vendor had a weight written on their invoices, something I had logged but never paid too close attention to because we measured in yardage, not tonnage. There were some items that I would convert to yards because they only gave me weight, but then most had yards and tonnage notated, while this guy always turned in a handwritten ticket that said 45 yards. This is how it had always been. The office manager before me would order 3 loads of 45 yards of material. It would be delivered in the back. I don't think she would tell the back how much should be there, and I certainly never did either. Not until I started to notice the discrepancies. Not until I started creating processes to fix the discrepancies. Favorite vendor goes on to say, "Hey, I know the yard he picks up from. I pick up different material there and am friendly with them. They should have copies of the receipts. I am going to try to get them for you." He asked what day our last delivery was. I give him the details. Despite liking this vendor, I was pretty skeptical. Surely he just wants my business and wants me to pay more. Still, I couldn't lie and say I wasn't curious if what he was saying was right. That day he texts me some photos of the receipts. Sure enough, that vendor's name is on them. The date matches. The driver's name matches. I hadn't shared that. The timestamps even matched from how long the drive from this yard to our yard was / when he arrived according to my cameras. So, he was picking up only 20 yards of the material each time. He was overcharging us 75 yards each time we ordered / paid, which is how he was giving us such a deal. It turns out the owner had demanded previous office manager negotiate this deal. I dug up all our past dealings with him. Unfortunately, previous office manager had not kept receipts, so I only had past checks in our system to go off of. We had worked with this guy for years. Potentially it was tens of thousands of dollars in theft. But without receipts, there wasn't much we could do except not work with him anymore. I asked favorite vendor for his price. I checked around with other vendors, found it to be a decent price, started to order from him from there on out. So yeah, that guy never worked with that bitch again. He got what he wanted. He reached out to coworker a few times when we stopped ordering. Coworker told him each time, talk to office manager. He called me once, but I didn't answer. He had said he never wanted to talk to me again either, so he got his wish. I am no longer the office manager, thank God. I hated that role and rejoiced the day I was able to hire someone else for it. The current office manager still cuts checks on Fridays only. I was able to sit her down and give her a lot more information / training than I received. We now work with far more established companies that have 30-day policies and credit. This is more due to development in our area making bigger companies available to us. Favorite vendor actually sold his company to one of those bigger companies, which is sad, but business. The next one is an entitled people story. My 20F mom 41F is wanting to move back with me and my siblings. I'll try to keep it short, but basically she and my stepdad got divorced in November of 2020 because he caught her texting another guy. It was messy and he ended up leaving that same night and we didn't hear from him for a few months, which I don't blame him for since he was going through a lot, betrayal, and needed to process some things. He's still very much supportive and takes care of us kids. I say stepdad just for the story, but I do take him as my true dad. My bio dad wasn't in the picture much at all, and my stepdad took me in as his own when I was a baby. So he is my dad. This is relevant because I feel some people might think I don't have a close relationship with him, but I do. He's the best and I love him. He treats me like his own. After that, she left and moved in with said guy, and has left us 4 siblings at home without any parental supervision and has been like that since. She was really horrible to us kids since she moved in with the guy and treated us like we were a burden. Sometimes acting like we didn't exist while she played mommy to his younger kids. Me and my older sibling had to step up and take care of us all, me up until I was legal age, but I helped. When she left, all she said was, "There's more than enough of you to rely on each other, and you'll get it when you're older and have children of your own." Personally, I wouldn't abandon my kids for an abusive guy, but maybe that's just me. Sarcasm. She would come back sometimes, but it was only for a day or two to come and get clothes or if they got into a fight and then leave back to him who lives 3 to 4 hours away. We got into a huge argument a few months ago when she and the guy broke up and he kicked her out for the billionth time and tried to guilt us saying kids need their moms and all that. I told her something along the lines of, "When did you care about this 5 years ago when you left us claiming we'd understand when we were older? We're older now, and we still don't understand how a woman can do that to her kids." After that, she got mad, and that's where the argument started. She said some not so nice things about me and my siblings that I won't repeat here, but just know it was things a mother should never say to her kids. It ended with her going and staying at our grandparents' and texting my older sibling and I guilt trips and playing victim that my grandparents told us to block her. But spoiler alert, she went right back to him a few days later. After this, my older sibling took her to court for custody of our younger siblings and the house and told her if she doesn't hand over the kids or the house in their name peacefully, they'd out her in court and tell them what she's been doing. Blackmail isn't right, I know, but it worked. My mom gave the house and the kids to my older sibling and claimed to be an unfit parent. That was it. Now, she and the guy broke up and are apparently done for good as he's thrown out all of her things. She got a new number and called my older sibling asking if she could have her room back in the house and she would never leave us again. We've already turned her room into the youngest's and she likes her space. Obviously, we told her no. This is when she started playing the victim card and tried turning it around on us, saying that we are mean and she's done everything for us kids and that our dad turned us against her. We told her our dad doesn't even talk about her anymore unless we bring her up, and then she started getting mad saying we are ungrateful brats again, and that we should be thanking her for even giving us the house and not throwing us out like she wanted. She then proceeded to demand that we let her move in and that she wasn't taking no for an answer, that she raised us and that she's still the mom and has final say. We threatened her and told her if she even tries anything, we would get the police involved, but so far that hasn't stopped her. She's gonna try and move in sometime tomorrow because all she said was, "We'll talk in person about this. See you soon. Love you." And honestly, don't even know what to do if she does. I really hope she doesn't go through with it so we don't have to get the police involved, but so far, that looks like where it's going. Today we changed the locks thanks to some advice. Edit. Good morning. I honestly really didn't think this would get that much attention. I just posted and went to sleep. I just brought the kids to school and am at work till noon. My older sibling is at home waiting to see if she shows up this morning at all. We decided to take shifts, them for the morning and me for the afternoon, so the house isn't left alone. We also contacted our uncle and aunt on my dad's side for support in case. Thank you so much for the nice and supportive words and the advice. I'll make sure to read everything once I can. Have a good day. Anyway, thank you for watching.